today is adjudicating. That might seem like the, less glorious part of debating, but it is, I think, a very useful skill to have. Firstly, because there'll be a lot of instances where being able to adjudicate will be important. So if you try to make an Easters team, you don't make one this year, trialing to adjudicate at Easters, where there are 3 spots reserved for novice adjudicators, is one way to make sure that you're able to be involved in the tournament. As time goes on, if you are sticking around with society and you are a pro who can't go to tournaments like Easters, being able to adjudicate and go to tournaments in that capacity is also important. It's just another way to be involved in debating. But I think it's also very useful to become a better debater. So I think the best debaters, the skills that best debaters have, I think, are quite similar to some of the skills that the best adjudicators have. And those two things don't necessarily translate to one another all the time, but being able to weigh up ideas in debates, being able to make an assessment of what is important to talk about in debates or what is strategic to talk about in debates, all of those things are things that are absolutely useful for adjudicating, but also then translate to being a better speaker. So I think it is an important skill that's certainly worth working at. What this seminar will do is it's going to assume some basic knowledge, so some familiarity with how 3-on-3 debating works, and also with the roles of each speaker, what you would expect the first and second and third speakers to do. But if there are any questions about that, just throw your hand up and ask to clarify that, and we can work that out. But that is the baseline of what we were expecting in terms of assumed knowledge. But again, jump in if you have any questions. So there are, I think, a few elements to how you should be considering judging a debate. Obviously, there are rules that restrict the debate. So there are rules to how the debate actually plays out and the structure of the debate. There are 3 speakers on each team. The speaking times are no more than 8 minutes, 15 seconds. There are rules around how you should adjudicate persuasiveness and what is a persuasive argument, what is not a persuasive argument. But beyond that, more specific, Procrustean structure, there are also, there's also guidelines for how you can adjudicate. So how you might assess various aspects of the debate. What does being comparative mean? How do you assess different frameworks? How do you assess how engaging, or how each team has engaged in the debate? So that is, I guess, like a kind of summary of how you might approach judging, and that's what we'll follow through in this seminar. So in terms of structure and the rules that flow on from the structure of the debate, like any sports, there are restrictions on the way that you can win a debate, right? So in football, you can't pick the ball up with your hands and throw it in the goal. But doing that would not mean your team lost that match. And similarly, breaking the rules in debating isn't going to lead to an automatic loss. So that is something that you'll probably hear at every judge briefing you ever attend throughout your time as a debater at university. But I think, and it sounds straightforward enough, but I think it's something that people forget a lot. You will hear judges who maybe aren't as experienced or who aren't as strong talking about teams doing things they shouldn't have done when justifying a particular decision. You can't get an automatic loss. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. And so if you breach a rule like speaking for longer than 8 minutes and 15 seconds, or a speaker in the debate you're judging does that, the remedy is not if they speak for, say, 15 minutes to mean to give them the loss. Hopefully you will have told them to sit down before then. But if they speak over time, obviously the remedy is not that they lose. The remedy is just that the stuff they say after that time can't factor in the debate. Put your pen down, stop listening, whatever it might be. But I think that is a very important baseline for approaching adjudicating, is that there are rules, but those rules aren't hard and fast reasons why one team must automatically win or one team must automatically lose. And they factor into how the debate goes, but they aren't reasons why one team will win or not. Part of the rules and the structure of debating is also role fulfillment, right? So that is, when we talk about role fulfillment, we mean what each speaker's job is, what roles they need to fill the ordinary requirements of being that speaker. And obviously, the first and second and third speakers all have slightly different jobs and slightly different expectations, but there aren't many hard rules that mean you need to do a particular thing as a particular speaker. So it is generally the case that a first affirmative speaker might define the scope of the debate or clarify ambiguities, and that's what you think of as a model. but if the first speaker fails to do that, and then a second after that definition is clarified, that is a totally acceptable way for the debate to pan out. So again, teams can't automatically lose the debate or win the debate because of the nature of their role fulfillment. So a team that had a first speaker who did exactly what you'd expect of a first speaker, and a second speaker who did the same for a second speaker, a third who fulfilled that role, but doesn't necessarily have as strong or as persuasive a case as a different team that was maybe a bit more haphazard, that maybe clarified its model later or things like that. That latter team would still win the debate if it was more persuasive. Role fulfillment is important, and it's important to become a better debater if you want to fulfill those roles, but it isn't a reason why one team would be better or not. The fact that you follow the established rules slightly better than the other team isn't necessarily the metric on which you judge a debate. Next thing to think about in terms of kind of the structure of how debates work is different types of motions. You probably have some experience with this from the standpoint of being a speaker, but this is obviously worth keeping in mind as a debater as well. The most straightforward motions obviously are debates like that we should do X, so in this case that we should ban school uniforms. And obviously in that debate it's a question of whether the government or we, usually meaning the government, should or should not do something. And that is regardless of the fact as to whether that is likely to happen in real life. So that's what we call government fiat, and that's an important thing to keep in mind in debating. So the fact that, for instance, a particular policy might be really unpopular isn't a reason why on the negative you could say that's something we shouldn't do, or something that isn't a reason why the negative team would get ahead. So the government or the affirmative team in that debate has the ability to fiat things that are in line with the topic. You can say that it might be implausible in being carried out to the best possible way that can be carried out. You could say there might be problems with how a particular model or idea might be carried out, but rejecting the premise of the debate isn't really something that the negative team can do. So in debates like that, the affirmative team has the ability to fiat things that line up with what the topic is talking about. There are also motions then that this kind of format of that we believe that one actor should do a particular thing, so that we believe that the US should invade Venezuela. You've probably heard of what an actor debate is. This is not an actor debate, even though there is a particular actor we're talking about, because the debate is not from the perspective of that actor, right? So this debate is saying that we, as a neutral or impartial observer, thinks that this particular action should happen, and so the assessment you're making in this debate is as a neutral observer. So what kind of things do we think we would be worried about if the topic were that we believe the US should invade Venezuela? What kinds of things are important in the debate? What kinds of things would teams potentially be bringing up that the adjudicator would be assessing the importance of? Any ideas?
It would create a really, really big bad war.
It would create a very bad war, which would be bad for who?
Everyone.
For lots of people, but the point is, because it's not an active debate, you can talk about the impacts on lots of different people. So, as a neutral observer, we probably care that people in Venezuela would die. We also maybe care that American soldiers would die. We also maybe care that there'd be refugees in other countries like Colombia and countries surrounding Venezuela that would disrupt those countries. But the point is that you're kind of making an assessment from a broad scale point of view. In contrast, if the topic that as the United States we would invade Venezuela, what would be different about that? Yes?
You don't care about Venezuelans, or you only care about them in as much as Americans care about Venezuelans.
Yeah, exactly. So that's an active debate, and what that means is that you're thinking about it from the perspective of the US. So, the affirmative team in that debate could say, all right, well, this will be great. Venezuela is a very resource-rich country. We can get a lot of oil. We can extract a lot of wealth out of Venezuela. That's great for the United States. Now, does that mean the negative team can't talk about, for instance, the civilian casualties that would result or the human rights abuses that would result? No, as Mark mentions, it is perfectly plausible to prove that we should care about that as the US. But the point is that that is work you have to do as the team on that side. So again, another type of topic is that we believe in a particular thing. So this is kind of an assessment of whether or not the motion is something that we support. It's not about advocating a particular policy. Again, motions about supporting or opposing a particular thing are not policy-based, but based on a broader assessment. Regret debates are a debate where you are considering what the world would look like if X thing had not happened, so if the creation of the Eurozone hadn't happened. And that obviously involves thinking about the counterfactual. So that debate is not just a debate, to take this example, where you're asking, what are some good things and what are some bad things about the Eurozone, it is specifically asking teams to consider the counterfactual as well. So what would have happened in Europe in the last 30, 40 years in the absence of the creation of the EU and the Eurozone? What would Europe have looked like otherwise? And comparing that alternative world with the world that exists, rather than just like listing good or bad things about a particular thing. And so, again, we've got that phrase of government fiat again. That isn't something that teams necessarily have in regret debates, so you can't get up there on the app and say, well, we regret the creation of the Eurozone because the world would have been perfect and totally peaceful and all the things in the counterfactual, and assume that's the case. You have to prove why that counterfactual would be likely. So in these debates, that is probably going to be an element, if the debate goes as it should, that you will be judging as an adjudicator, is answering the question of, well, which team showed the more plausible counterfactual? It's unlikely the teams will agree about what the counterfactual is, because that's not necessarily strategic for both sides symmetrically. So assessing who proved a more plausible counterfactual is an element of regret debates that you will uniquely need to be considering. Obviously, then we have act emotions. We discussed this with the one from the perspective of the US, but for example, you could get a topic like that as Bernie Sanders. We would drop out of the Democratic primaries. If that is the topic, what kinds of things are we assessing there? What is kind of the metric for whether we should do this or not? Is the metric what is good for the Democratic Party?
What is good for Bernie Sanders?
Yeah, and those two things could align, and you could certainly prove, you could make an argument that, well, yes, this is absolutely something worth doing because, Bernie cares about the Democrats, or Bernie wants to defeat Trump, whatever it might be. But crucially, the metrics on which that debate is likely to be judged are what is specifically good for that actor. So when you're speaking in these debates, but also when you're adjudicating actor debates, it's really important that you make sure you keep in your mind that someone saying that this will be good for the world at large, or it will be good for the Democratic Party, or it will be good for American voters, to use this example, none of those things necessarily matter unless they draw the link to the actor in question, right? So that is something that I think it's really important to be cognizant of when you're judging debates like this, is to think, what are the metrics that we should be judging this debate on? If you're judging a particularly good debate, those teams will hopefully have established what those metrics are. So they will hopefully have said, well, this is what Bernie Sanders cares about, this is why it aligns with that, or doesn't align with that. But at times as a judge, you're also going to have to, for debates that aren't as strong or debates that aren't as clear, you're going to have to make that assessment for yourself. Okay, so, an obvious issue that comes out more in some debates, but certainly across a lot of the different types of debates we've been discussing are definitional challenges. If you debated in high school, almost certain you would have experienced a definitional challenge at some point in your time. And so one of the, I think, hardest things to adjudicate is a debate that kind of devolves into a shit show because both teams have a very different idea of what the debate is about. Hopefully that will be a rare occurrence when you're adjudicating, but you will sometimes be in rooms where the teams aren't as strong, or the topic that was set was not a particularly clear one, and in that case being able to answer this question is important. So when is it okay for a negative team to be launching a definitional challenge? So some common examples of where this is reasonable is if a team on the affirmative unreasonably sets the debate in a particular location. So the example up there of legalizing marijuana, most debates at a university level, you should assume take place, don't have a specific place setting. Obviously, there are ones where there is a reasonable place for it to be located, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But on a topic like legalizing marijuana, it's pretty reasonable to expect that the same arguments that apply in the US apply in Australia, apply in the UK. And so you can challenge a definition which says it's just in one country. Similarly, if the debate is defined for a particular time period, or a time period that isn't clear cut, the presumption that should be that we're talking about right now. If you're saying, oh, well, no, this is why we wouldn't ban school uniforms in the 50s, obviously that's an unreasonable way to define the debate, and that's worth challenging. And the last and probably clearest one is where the affirmative team does something called squirreling, which I guess is just a catch-all term for when a team kind of tries to get away from the topic that they're arguing. So an example of that would be, let's say you get an AF that you think is a bit difficult or is a bit extreme, so you might get an affirmative like that we should abolish prisons. And you might think, oh, well, that sounds like a pretty hard thing to prove, that's a pretty controversial and dodgy idea. And saying, as the affirmative team, all right, well, we're going to abolish prisons and replace them with facilities where we lock up criminals, and we're going to call them, rehabilitation centres. and they are largely the same as prisons, that's probably a squirrel of the debate, and that's something that is worth challenging. So if you're trying to run away from what you're defending, or you're trying to read into the topic in a way that it wasn't really intended, that is the time where it is reasonable for the negative team to challenge it. There are instances where the negative team probably doesn't have a right to challenge the affirmative team's definition. So the AF, obviously, kind of for debates to function effectively, has some leeway in being able to exclude anomalies and instances where the motion doesn't really apply. So for a topic about democracy or selling votes, as the example there, it would be kind of silly for the negative team to say, oh no, this debate is also about China, or also about North Korea. That debate doesn't really operate in those instances. So it's fair for them to say, this should be about democracies, yeah? A team squirreling the debate or misinterpreting the motion obviously also cannot automatically lose, right? So when we say there are no automatic losses, that applies to this as well. And so as speakers, but also as adjudicators, when there is contention over the topic, whether it is something that is a complete and total misinterpretation of it, or something where it's, there are questions to be had about what the motion really means. It is important for both teams and for the adjudicator to kind of think about the debate on both levels, if that makes sense. So the same way that you would be told as speakers to take the opposition at their best, adjudicators should also be assessing the debate on both definitions, and the adjudicator may well decide that one team's definition is correct, but they should still assess how the debate goes on each level, if that makes sense. And if the affirmative team's definition is vague, or not really clear, then that doesn't mean the negative team can kind of swoop in at first neg and say, all right, the affirmative team didn't define this debate, so we're going to do it for them. They can point it out, and they can kind of draw conclusions from it and say, this is what we think is most likely, but they can't simply say, all right, well, this is now the definition. First staff, didn't fulfill their duty. We're going to do it for them. There are often going to be vague definitional debates where the definitions are vague and are not resolved at all, but the absence of that doesn't mean that a speaker can just swoop in and resolve that for you. So on definitional challenges, how you should adjudicate them. So obviously definitional debates are messy and they're not really debates many people want to see, but a team launching a definitional challenge shouldn't just be punished for the fact of doing that. Sometimes that can be reasonable, sometimes there is genuine ambiguity in the topic, and so that's not like a prima facie reason to punish them. They should only really be disadvantaged if there's like a definition that they've made that has confined their ability to make arguments. So you're ultimately judging the argumentation. If the argumentation is of a worse quality because of how they define the debate, then I guess that's a reason why you might punish the definition. But you're punishing the arguments, not the initial definition, if that makes sense. And where there are very different conceptions of the debate, you are going to use what we've just discussed to determine whether the challenge was correct and proceed from there. But the best teams are the ones that will assess it on both conceptions of the debate. That should not mean, however, that you don't make your assessment of what is reasonable. Like an affirmative team could blow the other team away on their weird conception of the debate, and on the actual conception, which was meanwhile happening in the debate as well, it could be a more narrow victory for the negative team. You can ignore the debate on a particular conception if you think it is totally unreasonable, but that is still something to be cognizant of, and particularly because the strongest teams will assess both of those things. In terms of persuasiveness, so this is more getting onto the guidelines of how we judge what arguments are strong and what rebuttal is strong, and so on. Very simply, the way you assess debate is which side is more persuasive based on what they are attempting to prove and within those constraints. So that's from the World's Judge Manual, and persuasiveness, again, is a word that you will hear a lot. So the way that you would assess persuasiveness in any debate is generally based on this idea of the ordinary intelligent voter. It is a bit of like a silly metric because the ordinary intelligent voter isn't really someone that exists. We all have our biases, and we all have our particular niches of knowledge or blind spots in terms of knowledge. But what you should be aiming for and aspiring for as an adjudicator is to consider the debate from this perspective. So that is someone who doesn't have isn't factoring their opinions into that decision, who has a reasonable amount of general knowledge, but not really technical ideas. So you might be assessing a debate about moving to solar energy, and you might be a science student who knows a lot about that technology, that is not a reason to be making assessments as to persuasiveness from either team based on what you know, right? So if a particular team is making an argument that because of your niche knowledge or some subject that you're doing or a thesis that you've written or whatever, and you think that might be inaccurate on those reasons, but the ordinary person wouldn't be discounting that argument, then it's not reasonable to enter the debate and start the debate or involve your adjudication with a discussion of what you know about that topic. Debaters, so that shouldn't say debaters should not use facts. That should say that it doesn't mean they shouldn't. Debaters are obviously allowed to use facts. There are obviously facts that we all accept and would be aware of. If there are niche facts or niche statistics, it is important that they explain them, explain why they're likely to be true, and obviously the strongest arguments aren't just examples or facts that they can offer, but will also have analysis backs them up. So analysis is the central metric for how you assess the persuasiveness. So what that means is you should be considering as a judge the reasons why an argument might be true or might not be true. And so that might include things that explain why something is likely to happen or why something might be the case. It might be based on, if you're talking about a principal argument, someone pointing out moral intuitions or making analogies and comparisons to other moral intuitions to show why that applies in this particular instance, or extending the logical implications of a particular argument. The things that are up there are all ways in which analysis can help advance a particular side. The ways in which an analysis, I guess, is factored into debate isn't just what is presented, but it's also about how detailed it was, how precisely it was explained, how plausible it would be to an ordinary person. So, like, if your argument requires a degree in quantum physics, the fact that you as the adjudicator might have that and might be able to understand it isn't necessarily a reason to credit that. The argument has to be explained effectively, aside from your niche levels of knowledge and aside from what the particular team or particular speaker might know. Crucially, where you might have heard a lot of talk about manner, matter, method as this metric for how you judge debates or how debates are judged in high school, manner isn't necessarily a distinct thing from the matter of what teams are bringing. So there isn't a particular manner or a particular style of speaking that you should consider most persuasive. To the extent that style factors, if you genuinely can't comprehend what the speaker is saying, or the arguments genuinely don't make sense to you, that is where there is obviously some relevance to that. But as the adjudicator, really, it's on you to try and understand what the speaker is saying as much as possible and to make a really, really serious effort to do it. If, for instance, the speaker has an accent or is a ESL or an EFL speaker, it isn't reasonable at all for you to say, oh, well, it was hard to follow or I couldn't quite understand. It is on the adjudicator to be following that as clearly as possible. And as a speaker that has as strong arguments as another speaker, but said it more eloquently or said it in clearer English or in a particular accent, it isn't reasonable to necessarily preference that speaker. So matter is the essential part of how we assess persuasiveness, and so analysis is the most important part there. Another thing to consider in assessing persuasiveness is in terms of how coherent the team's arguments are across speakers. So obviously when you have three different speakers, when teams are trying to make rebuttal, when speakers aren't necessarily listening to every word that each other has said in their speeches because they're writing their own speeches while their first speaker's up there or whatever, it is a thing, it is a common occurrence that teams might contradict themselves, and crucially, they cannot get the credit of both claims. Whether or not the negative team points out the contradiction, your role as a judge is to identify those contradictions as well. So even if it hasn't been pointed out, if there is a contradicting point in the second affirmative speech to what the first affirmative speaker said, when the second half was rebutting something from the negative team, they can't claim the benefits of both of those things. But crucially, it also doesn't mean that when there's a contradiction, you kind of lock out everything that they've said. You have to kind of make an assessment of which one better reflects the argument the team was making. Usually it's the first analysis that they offer, but if it's third speaker, they clarify that, all right, no, what we meant was what our second speaker said, not what our first speaker said. Then that is obviously an assessment that you have to make. So you can accept one of those pieces of analysis, or accept parts of those pieces of analysis, but you can't accept both of the claims that contradict one another. Equally, you shouldn't dismiss both simply because there was a contradictory element to it. Obviously, that's not an automatic loss in the way that we've talked about. That isn't really something that happens. In terms of assessing persuasiveness regarding rebuttal, I think a common way that people think about rebuttal early on in their debating careers that isn't really accurate is to assume that an argument that's been rebutted has been totally dealt with, or an argument that hasn't been rebutted kind of stands, and that definitely isn't the case. The fact that there might be some weaknesses in the argument doesn't completely discount that argument. There are parts of that argument that still stand. And on the flip side of that, the fact that an argument hasn't been rebutted obviously also doesn't mean that argument stands. So a team could make a pretty preposterous or not very well explained or quite implausible argument. And obviously, as an adjudicator, it's not your job to make arguments for the opposition, but you are able to assess, is this a persuasive point? Are the claims this team is making following from one step to the next in a logical way? And if it's an argument that isn't particularly persuasive on those metrics, the fact that it hasn't been rebutted doesn't just mean it stands in the debate. That is something that you have to assess. So it is reasonable to discount, particularly ludicrous things or whatever. Another thing to keep in mind in the way you assess debates is obviously categorizing things into your arguments and your rebuttals is somewhat useful in terms of having a grasp of where the debate is at, but don't get too caught up in that distinction and look for the ways that a team's arguments or their case implicitly responds to what the other team has said. So there might be something that the first affirmative speaker said. There might have been a piece of analysis that responds actually to what the negative team has said, and the fact that they don't then explicitly label that as a rebuttal or as a response to that doesn't mean that that doesn't factor. Does that make sense? So it's important that you are willing to compare those two cases and do some of that legwork. The fact that something is labelled as an argument doesn't mean it can't be responsive to what the opposition has had to say. Another thing in terms of guidelines is in terms of how you weigh up the frameworks that a debate is happening in. So often in debates, the criteria upon which a debate should be judged is disputed because it makes sense for both teams from a strategic perspective to take a different look at how the debate would operate. So what we mean by frameworks, I guess, is let's take that example of the Bernie Sanders debate of that as Bernie Sanders we should drop out of the Democratic primaries. The affirmative team might have a framework which says here are the things Bernie cares about. Bernie cares about party unity. Bernie cares about defeating Donald Trump. Bernie cares about getting some progressive goals, even if that means not being able to achieve everything. The negative team might say, no, Bernie actually cares about personal power. Bernie actually cares about getting the most progressive policies through and doesn't believe in compromise. No, Bernie isn't that interested in defeating Trump. He's interested in creating and mobilizing an overall left-wing movement that will lead to long-term change in the US. Those are two very different, but both fairly plausible ideas of how that particular actor would operate. And those are two frameworks that, basically are going to clash potentially if you get a debate on that topic. So it's not a question then of what you believe is important or what one particular team has said is important in assessing a debate. It is about how teams engage with those frameworks. So sometimes teams will say, this is what we think the debate should be judged on, and the negative team will agree with that, or the kinds of things that they focus on. So if you get a debate about Bernie dropping out and almost all of the arguments that both teams make are about party unity and how to preserve party unity, even if things don't explicitly say the framework we are judging this debate on is party unity, or the thing Bernie cares about is party unity, it's clear implicitly that that is the framework upon which you should be judging that debate. Again, if there are disagreements, if one team is able to prove that their particular metric is more likely, so that's where offering arguments which say, okay, here's why Bernie's priority is defeating Donald Trump, or on the flip side, here's why Bernie isn't so worried about what happens, in the next 4 years, it's more about building a long-term movement. If you can provide reasons for that, that is then how you make up that assessment. And very, very rarely, if there is no difference between how teams have been able to substantiate which framework to believe, and that's usually going to be pretty unlikely. It's very rare that after two teams speaking for an hour, offering all sorts of different ideas, they are exactly the same in terms of how persuasive they've been. But if you really can't be persuaded either way, then you might think, all right, what would the ordinary intelligent voter care about? I don't think you ever want to get to that stage. I think you want to be looking for implicit agreements. I think you want to be looking for whether one team proved a particular framework was more persuasive or not. And that is, I think, one of the crucial things that you'll have to do as a judge. A common mistake rather that judges and indeed teams might make is to think that there is one way to judge debates. So whether it is from a purely utilitarian framework or from a consequentialist framework. So you might think, oh well, doesn't matter if something's principally wrong if down the line it leads to more positive outcomes. It is not the case that there is one way to judge every debate or that there is one framework you can impose on every debate. If a team is, for instance, able to prove that doing a particular policy, even if it would lead to a great deal of positive practical outcomes, might be immoral, like, for example, banning smoking would probably make everyone a lot healthier, but a team could then, on the flip side, make the argument that personal choice is important and it would be immoral to restrict that, then that is still something that should carry weight in the debate, and that element of the framework is still something that's contestable. So don't presume that there is one way to judge a debate. Make sure that you are asking and questioning yourself as you're watching the debate and as you're coming to your decision. Why is it that this is the important thing in the debate? Why am I assuming this is the most important thing? Have I considered what the teams have said is most important? Have I let them prove to me what is the most important thing to consider? Further to that, in terms of weighing arguments, another thing that you will often have to do as an adjudicator is to consider how important the contributions of each team in a debate makes are. So very often you will see debates where one team has a set of arguments, they offer a few rebuttals to what the other team says, another team has a set of arguments, maybe offer a couple of rebuttals that don't really engage necessarily. And at the end of the debate you kind of have a set of claims on one side and a set of very different claims on the other without much engagement between it. And that is where it becomes really important to assess which argument should be weighed more in the debate and which arguments are more persuasive. I think there are a few elements of that. So obviously the plausibility of particular arguments, and that kind of comes down to the analysis they give you as to why something is likely to be true, the detail of the reasons they give you, maybe the examples they give you to the extent they're able to show those are important. Along with that plausibility, the importance of that argument, and also the likelihood of that argument to be carried out. For example, let's just give that a read. So the topics that we should ban school uniforms. Have a read of those two things, I'll give you a minute, have a think about it. What do we think is potentially the more persuasive argument or the one that we should weigh more strongly out of those two, assuming there isn't much rebuttal or engagement? What do we think? Any strong views? Mark?
I think the affirmative argument is probably better, just because the negatives is like, some people get praised, which is bad. And it's like, it doesn't seem like there's too much of a link between some people getting praised and,
Yeah, so what Mike's talking about there is like the plausibility metric we just talked about. So it seems more plausible that school uniforms aren't going to be the things that kids want to wear, and therefore that restricts their ability to express themselves and their ability to feel independent. That probably seems more plausible than the idea that, well, there are some very fashionable wear kids, and them getting praise is going to mean that lots of kids feel excluded. Can we think of another reason as to why the affirmative argument might be more persuasive or might be weighed more strongly? So that's the plausibility metric. It's more plausible maybe what the affirmative team is saying. Yeah?
It affects more people because in that scenario everyone's unhappy because they aren't able to express themselves. In the negative scenario it's just a couple of kids who feel that.
Yeah, so that speaks to the importance of the relative argument. So the first argument, you are assuming that the affirmative team's done a good job of proving it. They've shown that everyone is worse off if they can't express themselves. Everyone is facing more problems as a result. On the flip side, what the negative team is saying is that only some people might feel left out, only some people are worse off. Crucially, this is just one example. Do we think that the number of people affected by something is the only way to weigh importance?
No.
Why not? Any ideas?
Well, the negative emotional effect, like the negative team is claiming, I feel like has more weight than the affirmatives. Because if you compare how you're going to feel if you're uncomfortable in clothes because you can't express yourself, versus how you feel in your actual clothes in comparison to somebody else's that are obviously, they cost more money, they're more fashionable and stuff. It's more degrading, that comparison, than
Certainly.
just feeling uncomfortable because you want to look better.
Yeah, exactly. And so
You're all looking the same as well. Like there's more of a power play. There's more of a power dynamic in the second one, which is
totally. So obviously in a debate, there's hopefully going to be a bit more nuance to these arguments. So if the negative team is saying, we're able to point out that, well, if everyone's looking the same, the feeling of a lack of independence doesn't feel so relatively bad, that's going to have a factor. But yeah, you could make the argument certainly that these children feeling left out and alone is a much more acute harm. If, say, the negative team said, all right, and let's assume they prove this. They say people feel unequal, kids who are seen as less fashionable or less wealthy will get bullied, will potentially be facing physical bullying or violence and so on. Would that make it potentially the case that the negative team's argument is more important? Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, it isn't necessarily the case that how many people are affected by a particular thing is the only metric to weigh that. And that is where, there's not a clear-cut answer. You can probably read into this either way, and in a debate, hopefully there'll be more detail from both teams to substantiate that. The key point is that you're thinking about which one of these is more plausible, which one of these is more likely, and also which one of these is more important. And that is a question of more than just pure numbers. That is a question of how acute a particular harm is, or things like that, or if there are particular groups that we should care about, and so on. So what we'll go through now quickly is to think about some common problems with how we adjudicate debates. I think a very common one that I've certainly noticed in less experienced adjudicators or adjudicators who are new to the scene is how they assess third negative speeches. Third negative speeches obviously are permitted to introduce new rebuttal, so new responses to what the opposition has said is absolutely something that they are able to introduce and should be assessed. And I think the question you have to ask whenever you're judging a third negative speaker and you're thinking, oh, well, is this that important? It's coming out very late, is why does the third negative speaker exist if not to offer those contributions to the debate? So obviously it is a unique position and the affirmative team doesn't have a chance to respond, and that's not something, and that means you shouldn't ignore that fact. So the test that you should use, rather than totally dismissing what the third negative speaker has said, and certainly rather than saying, oh, well, the third negative speaker said it, I guess it stands, rather than going to either of those extremes, I think the best way to assess how third negative speakers, or to assess their contributions to the debate, is to use this idea of robustness. So how strong was the affirmative team's case compared to this negative team's new rebuttal? And that's where thinking about implicit responses, as we discussed before. So were there parts of the affirmative team's case that already contested some of this rebuttal or that could potentially undermine this rebuttal? To think about the strength of that rebuttal and the plausibility of that rebuttal. So if it's a really well-made, well-explained point and you're thinking, all right, well, it's hard to see what the affirmative team's potential responses would be here, then that probably speaks to the robustness of those responses and that rebuttal. But I think the key thing to emphasize is it is about a way up. It is not about totally dismissing what the third negative speaker has had to say or totally buying everything that they've said because there's no chance to respond. And look, I think the reality is, like a lot of the things that we've talked about, there's no clear-cut way to make that assessment. Every third negative speech will be unique, and every context and every debate that it's in will be unique. So the same as with weighing arguments where there's not much engagement, and the same with a lot of things we've talked about, it's a difficult layout to make. And it's often a context-dependent one. It's one that you'll get better at with more experience. But the key thing to keep in mind is how robust are these responses, not dismissing those responses and certainly not just accepting them. Another common problem that speakers have is placing too much emphasis on particular parts of the debate. So there are some examples up there of particular facts or knowledge that teams have. you might, and I've certainly watched a lot of debates in my time where I see a team that is probably composed of smarter speakers, that is probably composed of speakers who know more about the issue that they're discussing. They can drop more names, they can drop more examples and more facts. That is, I think it's important to avoid the trap of thinking that that team is getting ahead. The real basis that you're judging the debate on is the quality of argumentation, the quality of responses, the things that we've talked about, none of which are really about, whether you knew the name of Tony Blair or whether you knew the year he was elected or things like that. That's not to say those things are irrelevant, and that information can be really useful to make your analysis stronger. It means that teams can make specific and more particular assessments about the people involved or the times involved in a particular topic, but that isn't a reason to give a team a debate, and it's important to, I guess, temper yourselves from focusing on that too much. Similarly, and this kind of comes back to the point about frameworks and weighing that we were discussing before. Be careful in how you assess debates that you aren't making assumptions about what's important. So thinking that a practical argument is most important, or thinking that principal arguments don't matter, or maybe principal arguments are the be-all and end-all, those aren't assumptions that you should be making, and you shouldn't necessarily be prioritizing one of those things over the other. What instance would you prioritize practical arguments over principal arguments, do we think? Any ideas? What I'm trying to get at here is that the instances where you can prioritize those particular things is based on what the teams have done, right? And based on what they have proven. So whether it's a regret debate or a policy debate, it operates really the same in how you're assessing it. The crucial thing is the assessment should be based on what's happened in front of you. It shouldn't be based on what you think was necessarily important or what you found to be, particularly interesting or what demonstrated, that they knew more about one team than the other. The key thing is what has happened in the debate, what teams placed their focus on, what teams explicitly agreed on or implicitly agreed on, or, very often you will have way-ups within debates where teams are saying, all right, the reason the principal argument is most important here is for X, Y, Z reasons, or another team saying, no, why we should care about the practical arguments are for these reasons. Last thing is, don't, do, I guess you could call it penalty judging. So having arbitrary reasons why a particular team's arguments can't be credited as much or aren't as important is obviously something that you want to avoid, and certainly shouldn't be something where you're automatically penalising or discounting what the speakers had to say. That probably about sums it up. Are there any questions about that? Obviously, all of that, as I say, is at the end of the day, kind of about making a judgment call, being able to weigh out what's happened, and there aren't always clear-cut answers for disputes in debates. There are lots of different contexts. That is only something you'll get better at with practice, but I think that is a useful outline of some of the challenges that judges face.